Good evening, everybody. My name is Gabor from the Pollinator Pathways Project. It's very good to be here with you. I will be giving an overview of our project, talking about how to set up, create these pollinator pathways. We'll also have Sylvia and Jude talk about reaching out to youth. And Alex will give an overview of how you can use our online resources. We have some maps there, some things to download, and so he'll take you through that. All right, so let's get going. Creating. Okay, there we are. Okay, so the plan for tonight is going to take us through the 3 H's, the head, heart, and hands, but in a slightly different order. Because I believe that to have a real meaningful transformative learning experience, you really have to work with all 3 parts of our bodies. It's not just a cognitive understanding the topic, but we really need to feel, we need to falling in love with subjects, right? All of you know they're passionate about something. There's that heart affective component. And then we want to put it into action. So the first question is more about, why are we talking about pollinator pathways? Second is what are pollinator pathways? And finally, under hands is how do we create these pollinator pathways in urban areas? So before I get started about why we should care, I just want to give a shout out to all these amazing creatures which help pollinate 85% of flowering plants. So bees, butterflies, wasps, moths, beetles, flies, birds, bats, they all do a part. Now where we live, bees and butterflies are the creatures that do most of the heavy lifting. As we move towards the tropics, moths become more important, birds, bats, but certainly we have examples of each of them here as well. We can think of hummingbirds, different flies that do pollinating services. And let's not forget that there's also wind pollination, and in some parts of the world where we have unfortunately killed off most of these pollinators, well, humans have to get involved. So there's some orchards in China where people pollinate by hand. So why should we care, and do we care? You've probably seen some of these studies that suggest huge insect declines. So this one from Germany, where they observed a 75% decline over 3 decades. Here's the article in a bit more detail. So these are nature reserves embedded in the heavily built out landscape of Germany with agriculture and urban areas. So nonetheless, in these protected areas, they found a 75% decline. So this is huge. And here you can see the graph of the biomass that they've measured over these 30 years and across 63 different reserves. So you can see a substantial decline. So what happens when you lose these pollinators and other invertebrates? Well, they have knock-on effects on ecosystems because they are, part of the food chain, and other creatures are relying on them for food. So if you take them away, well, then you have other creatures that go missing. So here's another study. This is from North America. 2.9 billion birds have gone missing in the last 50 years. Now, this is not just due to the decline in the food availability, so on insects and other invertebrates. There's other things in here as well, but still, it's a precipitous decline, and part of it is the decline in insects that we've been observing. Birds go missing, lizards go missing too, and the whole food web is impacted. So this is another study from I believe it's Puerto Rico, and you can see from the 70s to 2011 and 12, there was a big decline in these lizards, these anoles, in the tropical rainforest there. Now, by bringing it home to what it means for us humans, to make it really visceral, well, we got, you know, if you take away all the pollinators, we'd have 33% less food available, because 33% of our food that we eat directly rely on pollinators. So if there are no pollinators, you can kiss goodbye to almonds, apples, watermelons, strawberries, raspberries, and there's a whole list of foods that we eat. Others will be impacted. There'll be smaller yields because pollinators really help boost the yields of coffee, beans, tomatoes. And can you believe that beef, milk, eggs are also impacted? How come? Because these animals are eating feed that are plants that are, you know, pollinated by pollinators. So they would be impacted too. Now, why? So obviously we should care because you know, it'll impact our ecosystems, our food. But I think we should care just because of the beauty of these animals. I mean, just have a look at these beauties from Ontario, where we have 400 species of bees. So these are native bees. Obviously, we have the honeybees, which are introduced species from Europe, but there's 400 of these native bees that that also are, not all of them are in decline, but a large portion of them are in decline, and some of them have gone extinct in Ontario. There's 100 species of butterflies, so there's a rich biodiversity here in Ontario that is being threatened. So in the second part, for the second question, what are pollinator pathways? So let's get into this topic. And where I like to start, because I'm an ecologist, is with the subject of ecology, which is looking at relationships. So how do different animals eat each other and how they eat plants? But it's also about the energy transfers, the gas transfers from carbon dioxide into trees and plants, and looking at all these processes and how they interact. So David George Haskell does an amazing job at describing these relationships in really poetic form. So if you'd like that kind of read, The Forest Unseen is beautiful. And if we would have more time, I would show you this nice video that he talks about these amazing relationships. Of course, pollination is all about relationships. It's the relationship between the pollinators, these butterflies, and the various plants, where they transport pollen from the male part, the stamens, and when they visit another flower head, then the pollen, some of those pollen pieces fall off and fall into the female part, the pistil of the flower, and then that can lead to fertilization there, and then the fruit develops. So if you take away, let's say, the bees, the pollinators, well, of course, it will have huge effects on the plants. The plants will then suffer, or you know, if you take away all the pollinators, well, then they'll die out as well. Or what if we are removing the plants because we are applying herbicides or whatever? Well, we're breaking down the relationships. And of course, I've shown you that these, you know, they'll take away any of these species, and you'll have knock-on effects in ecosystems. So what are the causes of species loss? So here, I'm asking a bigger question because it applies to not just pollinators, but all species. And if we would have time, I would stop and somehow would interact with you, and you would shout out various answers. And some of these would be habitat loss, degradation, habitat fragmentation, but there's also invasive species, climate change, there's diseases, parasites, application of pesticides and chemicals and all of that. But the main one, so if we had to name one, the biggest one so far has been habitat loss and degradation and fragmentation. So here you can see in London, we've gone from a landscape with contiguous forests to a landscape where we have these remnants. And this is from 1950, and now these remnants have become even smaller and fewer in between. So you can imagine that for especially the bigger species, the predators especially, you know, they have huge trouble existing in these landscapes. But now the patches have become so small that even the small insects are getting into trouble. So what can we do about them? Well, one of the main ways conservationists have been trying to piece together these smaller bits and pieces of habitat is by creating corridors. These pictures are from the Banff area. You've probably seen these. Then they're heavily used by the animals as they cross from one side of the highway to the other. In agricultural landscapes, where I guess where we are, hedgerows can act as ecological corridors. Riparian forests can act as ecological corridors. And there could be, and I'll show you some more, more stepping stone type corridors, little habitat patches where birds can land, insects, as they hop from one to the other. So do they actually work for pollinators? I won't get into this because we don't have time, but in these landmark studies from 2005, what they've shown in this forested setting is that where you have patches connected up, then butterflies, bees, wasps, they move along these low quality habitat corridors to the other bigger habitat patch. So corridors help to increase dispersal, gene flow, and so allow these pollinators to have bigger, better habitat. And I could also show you studies that are now looking at urban areas, showing that these pathways or these corridors, they do help pollinators and insects and other creatures. So here you can see some examples of where they are more like linear features in the landscape. So from New York at the High Line Park, or along hydro corridors, transportation corridors, you can set up beautiful pollinator meadows and gardens, or you can do more stepping stone gardens throughout neighborhoods, or they could be larger pollinator meadows in various parks, and that allows these animals to move across the landscapes. Okay, so here's an example of a pollinator pathway from the Cersei Society. This is a really nice example of what a local pollinator pathway looks like. So this could be in any of our neighborhoods, right? If all of us did a little bit, some of us might be setting up a prairie pocket because we love prairie flowers. Others have flowering shrubs, vegetable gardens, fruit trees. The city decides to plant a flowering median on the roadways. Others are setting up native bee lawns, rain gardens with flowering plants. And so here we're giving them a rich diversity of places where pollinators can get food, can find shelter, and different life stages. So it's important to think about the caterpillar stage for butterflies and so on, and the nest requirements for various bees. Most of those native bees in Ontario, they actually ground nesters. So all of you gardeners out there, leave a patch where you don't mulch too heavily so that the bees can find their little cavities in the soil. Okay, so some examples from around the world. There's now more and more organizations that are taking this pathway approach. Here's some urban examples. So the Meadowway is being built, I believe. There's Blooming Boulevards. Maybe you've heard of the Butterfly Way project. It's a Canada-wide, led by the David Suzuki Foundation. And then there's also rural projects around the world. So I'll just headline the Calgary Bee Boulevard because it's they have a very exciting news to share with us. because they found along this bee boulevard they set up in Calgary, they found one of the endangered bees that they haven't seen in that area in a long while. They found 2 gypsy cuckoo bumblebees. So that's pretty cool. You know, you build it and they come. So you can see in these pictures, they not only set up a nice wildflower meadow, but they have this bee hotel in the background. So cavity nesters. They probably have little ponds, so areas where bees can get some water because they get thirsty too. Okay, so really what's needed is a multi-scale approach where we have neighborhood gardens. So these are, you know, 1 kilometer to a few kilometer in size, citywide pollinator pathways. This is really helping the population dynamics of pollinators. Okay, so along you can see this dashed line going across London. There's parks along here, and if we set up a nice pathway around there, that would be, you know, a citywide pathway. And then we can talk about regional, like the Carolina and Canada meta corridor concept. Okay, so pathways are a social system, so it's really important. And so it's not just the ecosystems providing these services for us. You know, we get food because they pollinate, et cetera, but you know, when we start thinking about these pollinator pathways and we start thinking about the human network, well, we gain so much more than just the fact that there's flowers being pollinated. I mean, ecologically, absolutely, that's what we're going for. But you know, we build this network, this sharing network of knowledge and information, and we develop stronger sense of place. We can build community, and in essence, we're building a more resilient urban ecosystem by focusing on not just the ecological network, but the social network. And then we can expand this to think about governance. So bringing ecology into governance, you know, where we have these informal, loosely connected networks, because not, you know, problems are multi-scalar, multi-jurisdictional. City of London can solve it, or the province of Ontario can solve it. They need multiple actors. And so we need, for these problems, we need network governance that can be more adaptive, more dynamic. And so I believe that's also important. Okay, so let's talk about, I have about 5 more minutes to go here. So what about here in London, and what have we been up to? Alex will talk a lot more about the website. And I'm just reminded by, I looked at my notes and I realized that I wanted to ask 2 questions of the audience. So we have 2 polls, because we would like to find out how you found out about this webinar. So Kelsey, if you could put up that poll. Yeah, so great. So I'm seeing 31% the P3 social media, 31% Reforest London social media. Excellent. Okay, so I think we can close this one, this poll, and then the follow-up poll would be on how many people are, so per sign-in, how many attendees are watching the webinar. Most of you are as I would expect, are watching, listening alone. But there's some of you where there's 2 people. So that's kind of what I expected. I guess no big families sitting around the fireplace. I mean the computer, watching this. All right. So thank you so much again for tuning in, and we're going to do a bit more interactive things in a second when Alex takes over. So let me just go back to this presentation and tell you about the essences of our projects is really to empower people to plant a pollinator garden and then grow that network of gardens. So we've had workshops, we have handouts, and we've posted 2 of them, so you can download them or you can go to our website. And those of you who have not done this type of work, can you see yourself starting with a 1 meter by 1 meter patch? Let's start small and then work up from there. You're wondering what species you could pick? Well, we have a flyer for that. These are easy to source, easy to plant, easy to maintain species. If you have a sunny pollinator garden, you could pick some of these. So make sure you think about the food needs of pollinators from the spring all the way to the fall. Okay, so you want to have a diversity of flowers, and try to go all native, because many of the native pollinators will only feed on native plants. There's some of the generalists will also feed on lavender and other things that are not native. But if you can, try to go all native. And here's some of the key tips that you could follow. No pesticides, have a diversity of flowers. Don't forget about water. Mulch lightly, or leave especially in a southern exposure, leave the soil bare. And then embrace the decay in the fall, because there's some cavity nesters that need that. Okay, social is just as important. So I'll just show you some examples of what we've been able to accomplish. We've been really working at the neighborhood scale. And if we look at the neighborhood where I live, and there's 4 others from the project, the core team who live here, and we've been able to kind of empower a whole bunch of our neighbors. You can see these yellow dots, and a lot of these yellow dots, so they're all gardens, but they came about because of the project. We also helped out by sourcing some mulch and some plants, and then we planted a community garden here where you see the red. So I'll just quickly go through that. You can see some pictures of how we took over this traffic median. So there's some ideas there. If you have right-of-ways in your neighborhood, you can adopt the street and plant a pollinator garden. So here's some pictures. Here are some of the individual pictures. The one in the left, bottom left, you can see that's 1 meter by 1 meter. My neighbor Jimmy said, okay, Gabor, I'm going to do 1 meter by 1 meter. So there it is. And here's some other pictures from around the neighborhood. And of course, the pollinators that are attracted to the plants. So you build it or you plant it and they will come. Our next project is more trying to go citywide. And this is where working with other organizations becomes a lot more important. So the Dundas Street Pollinator Pathway is our next project, and we are hoping to set up 2 gateway gardens, perhaps canoe gardens like this one, and then get businesses and other people who live along the corridor to consider planting, maybe just in a pot or in a bigger planter box, some pollinator plants. And then I think it's the table is set, or things are ripe for a citywide discussion on talking about citywide pollinator pathways. And here's where Thames Tablet Land Trust, Reforest London, City of London, and a whole bunch of other organizations, we can talk in setting up these cross-city pathways along transportation corridors like the rail lines, or stringing together parks, and setting up these stepping stone pollinator meadows, for example, along these red. So the red dashed lines would be like, potential pollinator pathways. The blue ones are the river networks that already have really well-established ecological features. So yeah, governing together, as part of this this network approach. I think that's the next step. And here's some organizations that I listed that we've already talked to, and I think the next step is to sit down and start creating these pollinator pathways. So in wrapping up, creating pollinator pathways, create the habitat if you can in your own house, in your balcony. Start small, pot to meadow. If you have a big organization, you can think in the meadow scale. Businesses have reached out to us. Don't forget about the other requirements of pollinators: water and host plants for caterpillars. And then second, work with others to create more habitat, reaching out, building your networks, neighbor to neighbor, organization to organization, advocate for pollinators. And those of you who are really into the scientific part, there, well, you can study pollinators. There's something called citizen science that you can get involved with. So thank you very much. And now I'm going to give it over to Sylvia, who will talk about reaching out to youth.
Hi, Gabor. Just before you take off your screen, we do have one question. So I'm not sure if this is going to come up later in someone else's part, but it's a great question. Do you have any suggestions of where to purchase native plants? So in London, I guess.
Yeah, so in London, I'm just looking at our plant to pollinator guide, pollinator garden guide. So you can go to Heman's, Parkway Garden Center, Springbank Garden Center, although I think they just moved. There's some other St. William's, but I think that they only sell to bigger commercial scale. So the ones I listed, they should have native plants. These are the ones that come to mind. There's some Hawthorne Farms, which is they usually come to the Seedy Saturday and also to other events. So I've bought seeds from them. And you can also order from many of these places. I think there's some others that are just not coming up from my memory bank, but I'd be happy to answer that fully via email, so you can reach out to me, and I'll try to write down a more extensive list. So that's a great question. Thank you very much.
That's great. That seems to be the only other question that came in for now. You made reference to how to start a pollinator garden resource. I also wanted to mention that I've uploaded a couple of documents that are handouts that people can actually download right now if they want. So we'll probably send it out in the follow-up email as well, but if you want right now, you can download. There's how to start a pollinator garden and Pollinator Pathways Project mission statement.
Yeah, that's excellent. So thanks so much for pointing that out.